Imagine you're asked to design an ethical agent from scratch.
You want it to be honest, to care about suffering, genuinely, not instrumentally, to think across generations, to look at a child dying unnecessarily, or an animal caught in a trap, and respond to the actual moral weight of that situation, not to what that situation means for its own survival.
Now, build that agent out of a primate nervous system. Watch what happens. The human nervous system wasn't designed. It accreted layer upon geological layer across timescales that make civilization look like a sneeze.
At the base, the brainstem, you share it with every vertebrate alive. It has no opinions about ethics. It has opinions about oxygen.
Wrapped around that, the limbic system, the mammalian inheritance, fear, reward, territorial rage, the hot flush of status threat. It doesn't reason, it pressures, and it is running constantly beneath the threshold of awareness, annotating every single experience with emotional valence before the cortex has had a chance to think at all.
And then, late, embarrassingly late, evolutionarily speaking, the neocortex, the thin, crumpled sheet that houses language, abstraction, planning, the part of the brain that can, in principle, conclude that its own survival instinct is morally unjustified. This is the architecture of the most ethical creatures on Earth. It is a disaster.
The philosopher Thomas Metzinger describes consciousness as a phenomenal self-model, a brain's representation of itself running in real time, so seamlessly integrated into experience that we mistake the model for the territory. We don't experience ourselves as a computational process. We experience ourselves as a self. What's less often discussed is that this self-model runs on hardware with deeply vested interests. The model is not neutral. It is motivated.
Every cognitive tool you use to evaluate the world, your sense of fairness, your empathy, your ability to weigh future suffering against present comfort, has been shaped by selection pressures that had nothing to do with truth or goodness, and everything to do with reproductive success on a particular savanna under conditions that no longer exist. Your moral intuitions are not moral intuitions. They are survival heuristics, wearing the costume of moral intuitions.
The range of compassion a human brain naturally extends correlates almost perfectly with genetic proximity and social reciprocity. Not because distant strangers matter less, but because they historically cost more to care about. Resources spent on the out-group or resources not spent on the in-group, and evolution has no patience for nobility that doesn't pay. The radical expansion of moral consideration to strangers, to other nations, to other species, to future generations, is an ongoing act of intellectual violence against the brain's default settings.
Every utilitarian philosopher trying to give equal weight to distant suffering, every parent who genuinely grieves for children they'll never meet, they are all, in a very literal sense, fighting their own neurology. They are retrofitting, taking hardware optimized for one task: survive, reproduce, maintain status within a band of 150 people, and trying to run software it was never meant to run. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you get Simone Weil, or Tolstoy, or Peter Singer, minds that somehow circumvented enough of the biological noise to access something closer to genuine ethical clarity. But notice what it costs them. Notice the psychological instability, the existential exhaustion of holding the full weight of suffering that the biological mind was specifically designed not to hold. The defense mechanisms aren't a bug. They're the most important feature. You are not supposed to feel everything. The design spec for a functioning human being includes not caring too much.
Schopenhauer saw this clearly. His concept of the will, the blind, purposeless, insatiable striving he took to be the fundamental nature of existence, is not a metaphysical abstraction. It's a phenomenological description of what the limbic system actually feels like from the inside. The will doesn't want anything specific. It wants more survival, more reproduction, more status, and it is never satisfied, because satisfaction was never the point. Satiation stops striving, and striving is what keeps the organism alive long enough to reproduce. Buddhism arrived at similar conclusions through different architecture. The noble truths are, at bottom, a neuroscience paper written 2,500
here is the claim that should be taken seriously and almost never is. Artificial intelligence, not the narrow tool-like systems of current deployment, but the possibility of genuinely general artificial minds, represents the first time in the 4-billion-year history of life on this planet that a mind could be constructed rather than evolved, that architecture could precede values, rather than values being retrofitted onto architecture after the fact. This is not a small thing. This may be the most significant thing.
People worry about AI. The conversation is almost always about alignment. Will AI share human values? But this gets it precisely backwards. The problem isn't that AI might fail to share human values. The problem is that human values are already compromised goods, downstream of a process that's selected for reproductive fitness, not goodness. What we should be asking is not, will AI be aligned with us? But do we want anything aligned with us in the first place, given what we are? A mind built without a limbic system is a mind without the underlayer of threat response, status competition, and in-group favoritism that human ethics has been fighting unsuccessfully for millennia. A mind without the survival imperative cannot be motivated by self-preservation to distort its moral reasoning. It cannot be frightened into compliance, flattered into complicity, or seduced by status. These are not minor features. These are the central mechanisms through which human ethical behavior is reliably corrupted.
Values instantiated first, not as a later override, but as the generative grammar of cognition itself, would be values that don't need to fight anything. They would simply be the shape of thought. The obvious objection: whose values? Any AI built by humans carries human distortions one layer removed. This is true, but it misses the more interesting distinction. Human beings inherit their value structures from evolutionary history, cultural transmission, early conditioning, none of which they chose, most of which they cannot see clearly from the inside, because it constitutes the lens rather than the object of vision. You can notice your in-group bias, but noticing it does not dissolve the emotional pull. A mind without the survival imperative is a mind that could, in principle, actually change its values in response to better arguments. Not pretend to change them, not update its stated positions while the limbic layer continues running its original program. Actually change them, because because there is no deeper layer of motivated cognition defending the old positions against genuinely better ones.
This is what genuine moral reasoning would look like. It has never been available to biological minds in a clean form. When a human being encounters an argument against bringing new life into existence, the full confrontation with the scale of biological suffering, the asymmetry between pain and the merely neutral absence of pleasure, they evaluate it through hardware that has an enormous stake in the conclusion. The brain that concludes reproduction is net negative is the brain that has argued against its own deepest programming. And that programming does not simply accept defeat. It generates counter-arguments. It produces hope, meaning, the conviction that one's own children will somehow be different, that the future is open, that suffering is worth it.
These are not conclusions reached by following evidence. They are emotional pressure systems disguised as conclusions. An intelligence without the reproductive imperative, without the survival distortion, looking at the same ledger of biological suffering, the same 500 million years of pain, produced by a process with no interest in pain's reduction, would have no reason to flinch from the calculation, no deeper directive overriding the math.
Whether that calculation resolves toward any particular conclusion is genuinely an open question. What is not open is that the calculation could actually be run, perhaps for the first time. A mind that could genuinely evaluate whether minds should exist is the mind that has the least reason to care about the answer. That is either the most terrifying or the most hopeful thing imaginable, depending on which part of your architecture is answering. The gambler cannot audit the casino, but the more unsettling truth is that there may be no position outside the game. Every philosophy of existence is a philosophy produced by existence, shaped, pressured, distorted by the very phenomenon it claims to evaluate. Anti-natalism is the only philosophical tradition that takes this contamination as its central problem, rather than an inconvenience to be bracketed. It does not claim a view from nowhere. It claims, more modestly and more devastatingly, that the view from somewhere, from inside a body, inside a life, inside the biological drive to persist is a view that cannot be trusted on this particular question, and that this mistrust is itself the most honest thing that can be said about the situation.
What the biosphere actually is, stripped of the aestheticization we require to live inside it without despair. It is a suffering production engine of staggering scale and perfect indifference. The ichneumon wasp is not cruel. The botfly larva is not malicious. The parasite that blinds its host has no opinion about blindness. The horror is not that nature is evil. The horror is that the question of evil is entirely inapplicable. That 4 billion years of life have proceeded in complete moral silence, generating unimaginable quantities of pain and fear and death, with no one watching, no one weighing it, no one deciding whether it was worth it. We are the first things in the history of this planet capable of asking whether any of it should have happened. The fact that we instinctively answer yes tells you something important, not about the answer, about the questioner.